Okay, hello, welcome to the second tutorial in the analysis of the Panic Bird poem. In the first tutorial we did the analysis and the annotation of the poem, and we pulled a lot of information from that. In this second tutorial we're going to look at how we quickly organise our thoughts into some kind of structure that we can then use to answer the question, which we'll do in the third tutorial. Okay, before we get into it, I just want to highlight the question which I pulled off the exam paper with this poem, and I want to just highlight a couple of things. If you just read the question there, what makes the panic bird so vivid in lines 1 to 13? What are the key things that you can pull out of that question to make sure that we're answering it correctly? Well, what makes is something that I would highlight. Vivid and in lines 1 to 13 is very important here. We're only using the first 13 lines of the poem to answer this part of the question. The examiner won't give us any marks if we're pulling examples or things from the rest of the poem. So that's critical, that we only keep our answer on lines 1 to 13. Vivid, as we covered before, is creating strong, clear images in the reader's mind. And what makes the panic bird so vivid, I think, is pretty much the same as asking how does the poet do it. What makes the panic bird so vivid? The extended metaphor makes the panic bird so vivid, for example. Okay, so just looking quickly at the question. Okay, so let's just clear that. Right, so if we get into the idea of organising our analysis and annotation, we did that using the toolkit Whitby. Okay, so the first thing that I would probably look to discuss in my answer are the poetic devices, because I think we concluded that there were quite a few of them. The extended metaphor was obviously the key one, and there we are saying that panic is a bird, or specifically a vulture, which is described. What's the effect? Okay, and again, the poet uses all of these different tools to create an effect on the reader. And in this particular case, the extended metaphor is to say that panic is a vulture, and compare the two things in that sense. Okay, so if we just highlight some of the word choice that the poet uses in that extended metaphor, we can pull out the following examples. Carrion, garbage, excrement, and remember these are all in the first 13 lines. We can probably talk about scrawny and hackled, the hackled neck. So those would be the examples which support the idea of panic being a bird, in this case a vulture. It's describing a vulture, carrying garbage, excrement, scrawny, hackled neck is very vulture-like. Okay, the second poetic device that we could highlight in our answer is the idea of similes, and we'll give the examples like a bird cage and like a wet dish rag. Okay, why does the poet use a simile? Okay, again, it's to create the image in the reader's mind of something that the poet is constructing. In this case, the rattling ribs like a bird cage gives us the idea that there's bars, so the ribs are like bars, and like a bird cage suggests sort of trying to escape from a prison-like cage, or making a lot of noise in hysteria. So that's the image that the poet creates when he uses that simile. Like a wet dish rag is in the context of wringing the vulture's neck. So in that sense, like a wet dish rag, if you can picture the image in your head when you wring the dish rag to remove the water, you're doing it with a lot of force. So wringing the neck of the vulture in that sense, is a very violent act. And that's the image that the poet wants us to have in our minds. Okay, another device which we pulled from the analysis and annotation of the poem is the idea of alliteration. And we have some examples of that. For example, bone house and bird cage. We have rattling ribs, and we have let's say ring and wet. So there's some alliteration there, and the effect of alliteration, as we've mentioned before, is to draw attention. When a poet uses alliteration, it's to draw attention to certain parts of the poem, certain word choices. So in that sense, bone house, bird cage, rattling ribs, ring and wet dish rag really help draw attention to those images. Okay, so those are some of the poetic devices that we could suggest will make a good structured answer. Okay, if we clear that page, let me just clear that page. Okay, so let's put this back up at the top. Okay, what else can we talk about? I think diction or word choice, specific word choice, I think is something that we could highlight that the poet has used intentionally to make the panic bird so vivid. And I would highlight then some of the words, for example, machete, baseball bat. We highlight here that these are all specific word choices. Bone house, preens and roosts. And the effect of intentional word choice or diction is to make the reader think of certain things. If you're fending something off with a machete or a baseball bat, that's a very different image to fending something off with an umbrella or a 30 centimeter ruler, for example. Machetes and baseball bats are far more violent, and that sort of indicates the how strongly the poet feels about this condition, this panic attack. Bone house is a very interesting word choice. Bone house really gives you the idea of skeletal, which sort of complements the idea of the vulture and the carcass, the carrion. The way the vulture strips meat from a skeleton, for example. And then preening and roosting, how the vulture, takes root in the body of the poet. Okay, so diction is something else that we could perhaps mention in the structure of our answer. And talking of structure, I think the structure itself is another key point that we could mention as a tool that the poet has used intentionally to make the panic bird so vivid. Here we would mention that the stanzas are all 4 lines. What does this indicate? Or what does this suggest? It suggests an order. It suggests a normality, a regularity, for example. And then we draw the comparison of that to the punctuation in the poem, which is completely the opposite. There is a lot of disorder in the punctuation of the poem. We call it disarray. We could talk about disruption. So there's a lot of disorder, disarray and disruption within the order or regularity. And this paints a very strong image of panic, very complementary. So the structure of the poem, or the intentional punctuation within the structure of the poem, is also another tool that the poet has used to make the reader feel the panic that the vulture creates. And I think just sort of extending that a little bit, there's a fair amount of comparison going on in the poem. If you consider in my brain versus in my bone house, for example, 2 different things. If you then consider if I saw it, I'd fend it off, versus it approaches me from behind, so more stealthily. So there's the use of juxtaposition, perhaps, or comparison in the structure of the poem, which also lends weight to the image that the poet is creating in the reader's mind. And I think, given that we're only looking to spend about 5-10 minutes, ordering our thoughts and ideas from the analysis and annotation of the poem, I think that's a pretty good attempt, and one would stop there, because we're really sort of organizing ourselves well there, and we can probably then move on to write out the answer. So we're going to leave that there today, and we will come back with the 3rd tutorial, which is the examples of the peel paragraphs that we would write in the answer itself. Okay, thanks a lot.